Hello, little dreamer. Close your eyes and let the night hold you gently like a blanket of stars. We're about to drift into a story, soft and strange. A story of a princess made not from flesh or bone, but from sugar and shadows. This is the life of Princess Bubblegum, sweet yet secret, bright yet broken. A tale that hums softly in the dark corners of the Candy Kingdom. Eerie yet calm transition. Long ago, before kingdoms had names, before Ooh was Ooh, there was only the wreckage of a broken world. Ruins, ashes, echoes of what came before. From that silence, something unusual stirred. Life grew again, not the life of the past, but life spun from science and whispers of magic. And in the middle of that half-lit dawn, there was her, Princess Bubblegum. Born not as a baby, not with a cry or a laugh, but as a form that melded into being, shaped by sugar, shaped by science, shaped by shadows. She was candy, yes, but not only candy. Her smile was sweet, but her eyes always held the weight of something unseen. Gentle pacing, layering suspense. The Candy Kingdom called her their ruler, even when she was still so young. Because who else could rule a world stitched together from sweetness and sorrow? She walked the ruined lands with bare sugar feet, and with every step, the ground remembered. Some said she was chosen. Others whispered she was made. But deep down, Bubblegum herself did not know. She only knew that she was not like the others. For the candy people laughed and danced, while she remained awake at night, alone, hearing things that no one else heard. The walls of her laboratory would breathe at night, and the shadows of the ruined world whispered through the cracks in the floor, building slow tension but soft. She told herself it was only her mind, only science. But even then, there was a sense that she had been touched by something darker. That her creation was not just sugar and light, but also something that remembered the world before. So there she stood, the ruler of sweetness, born from candy, yet touched by shadows. Her story was only beginning, and the shadows had only just begun to stir. Now, little dreamer, let your breaths slow down. You've met the princess in her first hours of life, but her childhood is waiting for us. A childhood that was not truly hers, but one filled with silence, experiments, and eyes that always watched and imagined a child, laughing, running, stumbling through grass, holding hands with others, learning joy. But for Bubblegum, there were no toys, no play, no lullabies, sung by a mother's voice. Her cradle was a cold laboratory. Her lullaby was the hum of machines. And her family were the citizens she herself had created. She built them piece by piece, from sugar, from gum, from whatever she could bind together. Her candy people smiled, their round faces shining. They loved her. They adored her. But deep inside, she knew they were not her parents, not her brothers, not her sisters. They were her work, and she was their ruler. Eerie tone, soft suspense. At night, she would sit in her tower, feet dangling off the edge, and watch the candy people dancing below. She smiled with them, but her smile was hollow, because she was not one of them. She was a part, separate, a shadow in sugar form. When she tried to sleep, dreams would come. Dreams of voices she had never heard, faces she had never met, a family that never existed. Sometimes she would wake with tears on her cheeks, not knowing why. And in the silence of her room, she would whisper to the walls, "Who made me? And why?" suspense deepens, thriller edge but still calm. There were stories told among the candy people. Whispers that in the ruins beneath the kingdom, there were fragments of the old world. Things not meant to wake. Things not meant to breathe again. Sometimes, late at night, Bubblegum would wander there, her candle casting soft light through the broken halls, and she would feel eyes on her. But there was never anyone there. One night, she found a door sealed with iron. Her hand trembled as she touched it. It was cold, colder than any stone, colder than any grave. She placed her ear against it, and for the first time, she swore she heard breathing. Slow, deep, patient. She stepped back, afraid. And that was the first night she realized her kingdom was not only hers. Something else was living there. Waiting. Pause, soft pacing, dreamy. Her candy people never knew. They continued to laugh, to dance, to call her princess. But inside, she was still a child, still searching for her place, still haunted by the shadows she could not name. Her childhood was never truly hers. It was a crown placed too early, a kingdom too heavy, and secrets that whispered through the walls of her castle. So sleep, little dreamer. Rest in the memory of a princess who never had a childhood. But do not rest too deeply, because in the next chapter, we will follow her further, to the secrets she buried in the early kingdom. Secrets that would grow and twist and never stay silent. The Candy Kingdom glowed with colors that seemed eternal. Its people laughed, their faces wide and painted with sweetness. Everywhere there was music, movement, and joy. The citizens adored their princess. They bowed to her, followed her, and believed in the dream she had built. On the surface, it was a paradise. But paradise often grows out of buried things. And beneath the sugar streets, the ground was heavy with secrets. In the lower chambers of the castle, rooms stretched deep into the stone. No citizen ever entered them. They were silent, locked, sealed with codes only the princess knew. At night, the faint glow of her lantern could be seen through the cracks in the floor above. She worked there for hours that stretched into dawn, hands moving quickly, mixing, shaping, stitching together life. The hum of her machines was steady, but the silence around her pressed harder. She told herself the work was noble. Every failed experiment was a step toward protecting her people. Every hollow-eyed creation was part of progress. But when she looked into their faces, she felt the truth pressing in. Some of them were not mistakes. Some of them were watching her. One creation was spun from threads of hardened sugar. Its limbs too long, its jaw stitched shut. It leaned against the wall, eyes open, but unmoving. When she turned her back, she swore she heard its throat catch on a breath. Another had been molded from melted caramel. Its body never hardened, forever dripping into itself. She sealed it in a glass chamber and listened to the sound of each slow drop. At first, it was unbearable. Later, she realized it had begun to mimic a heartbeat. She locked these failures away, sealed behind thick doors in the lowest halls of the kingdom. No one else ever saw them. But she remembered. She remembered every form, every shape, every empty set of eyes that stared at her in silence. And beneath even these locked rooms, farther down in the ruins of the old world, waited the iron door. The same one she had touched as a child. The one that breathed. She avoided it now, but she felt it more strongly than ever. The kingdom above danced and sang, But the air around that door pulsed like a living thing. It waited without hunger. It waited without haste. It waited as if it already knew her. The candy people never asked questions. They laughed and clapped and called their princess wise. But when Bubblegum walked the bright streets, her smile was thin. Her eyes were distant. Because she carried the weight of what lay below. The kingdom had been built over the broken ruins of something older. And not everything in those ruins had stayed asleep. The hidden rooms beneath the castle grew crowded with silence. One by one, Bubblegum's creations filled the shadows. Some stood frozen, their sugar frames refusing to move. Others slumped against walls, their bodies too fragile to hold themselves upright. The citizens above danced, laughed, and lived, never knowing what had been left to rot in the dark. Bubblegum visited them often. Her footsteps echoed through the halls, steady and cold. She examined the glass cases, checked the restraints, tightened the locks. She told herself they were failures. But her failures would not stay silent. At first, it was only the sound of the glass, a faint tapping, as though something inside was trying to move. She would freeze as listening. The sound would stop. When she left, she was certain it would start again. Later came the whispers. Not loud, not clear, but soft, like sugar cracking under heat. The voices were not whole. Fragments only. Her name. A laugh. A sob. Words that had no meaning, but carried with them the weight of memory. She told herself it was the air, the settling of stone, the creak of old machinery. But when she pressed her ear against the glass, she could feel the vibration. The sound was alive. One of them moved in its case. The spun sugar figure with arms too long and a mouth sewn shut. She found it facing the wall one night, though she had left it standing straight. She turned it back, securing it with ropes. The next night, it faced the wall again. The dripping caramel form grew louder, its chamber filled with thick amber fluid, bubbling, straining against the glass. She reinforced the case with steel, but she could still hear it. The drops fell in patterns, steady, deliberate. It was no longer random. It was a rhythm, almost like language. She began sleeping less. The citizens saw their princess glowing with charm by day, but at night, her eyes sank deeper with exhaustion. Her experiments were awake, but not alive. They spoke, but they had no voices. They reached for her, though they had no strength to move. And every night, when she returned to the surface, she swore she could hear footsteps following her. But whenever she turned, the halls were empty. The iron door in the ruins below grew louder in her mind. She no longer went near it, but she dreamed of it. Always closed, always breathing. And sometimes, in those dreams, the failed experiments pressed their hollow faces against it, waiting for her to open it. She told herself she was still in control, that she was the ruler, the scientist, the creator. But deep down, she knew the truth. Her creations no longer belonged to her. They belonged to the silence of the ruins, the whispering dark that had been waiting all along. And still she worked. Still she built. Because if she stopped, the silence would grow too loud. And she feared what it might finally say. The Candy Kingdom shone brighter than ever. Its streets overflowed with music and color. The citizens bowed to their princess, their laughter echoing through the air like bells. To them, she was flawless, a leader of kindness, a figure of sweetness, a mother who had given them life. But Bubblegum had begun to notice something different. Not in her secret experiments, not in the chambers below, but in the people above. It began with small things. A citizen would stand in the marketplace, smiling, but unmoving. Others passed by without concern. But Bubblegum watched the stillness in their eyes. There was no sparkle, no joy, only emptiness. The next day, they laughed again, as if nothing had happened. But she could not forget. Another citizen, a small gumdrop child, was seen staring at a blank wall for hours. When Bubblegum approached, the child did not blink. Its smile stretched wide as it held, but its eyes were glass. When she touched its shoulder, it snapped back, bowed politely, and walked away. No one else thought it strange. But she knew what she had seen. The signs multiplied. Faces in the crowd lingered too long. Eyes that should have shone with sugar light were flat, reflecting nothing. When she spoke to them, they answered her perfectly. Too perfectly? Every word practiced, like actors repeating lines, and always, always, the smile. Late at night, as she wandered the castle halls, she sometimes heard footsteps behind her. Light, uneven steps, like a candy citizen, wandering without purpose. When she turned, the hall was empty. Yet in the morning, she would find a trail of sugar dust leading straight to her door. She began to test them quietly. Small questions, personal questions, traps in conversation. Most answered as they should. But a few paused, their heads tilted too far to one side. Their mouths twitched, their smiles trembled, and for a heartbeat, their eyes went hollow. Then they laughed again, as if nothing had happened. Bubblegum realized something dreadful. Her kingdom was not entirely hers. Some of her people were not entirely hers. They were changing. Or perhaps they had always been different. Copies. Shadows. Hollow shells waiting to be filled. She remembered the whispers in the laboratory, the glass tapping, the rhythm of the dripping caramel. She remembered the iron door, and the way her failed creations pressed against it in her dreams. The thought grew heavier with each day. What if the whispers had spread? What if the things she buried below ID had reached upward, slipping into the sweetness of her people, hollowing them from the inside? The kingdom still glowed. The citizens still laughed. But Bubblegum watched them with suspicion now, searching their faces for the truth. Every smile became a threat. Every laugh an echo. Every pair of eyes a window into something waiting in the dark. The throne room gleamed with polished candy stone. Golden banners swayed in the air, bright and sweet as the kingdom itself. The citizens bowed as they always had, their laughter rising in waves, their voices chanting her name. From her throne, Bubblegum smiled back. But behind her smile, her eyes never stopped moving. She studied every face, every gesture, every hollow second where a candy citizen's expression lingered too long. She heard their laughter echo against the walls, but in her mind, the echoes twisted into whispers. The throne was high, separating her from the crowd. Every step she took down its stairs was watched by hundreds of sugar-bright eyes. And still, she felt more alone than ever. At night, the throne remained lit by torches, long after the kingdom had fallen into sleep. She sat there in silence, listening for sounds that no one else could hear. A faint tapping in the stone, a hiss in the cracks between walls, footsteps that stopped when she turned her head. Her crown felt heavier each night, as if the whispers pressed against it. The citizens adored her, but she could not rest in their adoration. Their smiles stretched too wide. Their words sounded too rehearsed. Every cheer was hollow to her now, as if the voices belonged not to people, but to something else wearing their faces. Once she ordered the guards to clear the hall and leave her alone on the throne. The silence was unbearable. It pressed against her chest, thick and suffocating. She closed her eyes, and the whispers surged louder. They came not only from below anymore, but from the very walls of her throne room. From the air itself. She opened her eyes quickly, but the chamber remained still, empty. Yet she swore the shadows in the corners had shifted closer. Her throne became a prison. She ruled from it, but it ruled her as well. She sat upright, crown fixed, eyes sharp. Even in exhaustion, she never allowed herself to close her eyes fully. For she knew if she drifted into sleep there, the voices might step forward at last. And when she woke, the kingdom might no longer be hers. The candy people danced in the streets. They sang songs of joy. They believed their princess never faltered. But alone, in the silent hours of night, she clutched the throne as if it were the only barrier left between her and the things that waited in the dark. And so the throne remained, lonely, cold, a watchtower over a kingdom of sweetness, and the princess upon it, eyes fixed forward, never resting, never safe. The ruler of candy, the prisoner of shadows. The world was broken long before her. Oo was not yet a kingdom, but a wasteland of ruins and silence. Stone towers crumbled into dust. Rivers ran black with memory. The sky itself seemed tired, as if it carried the weight of everything that had been lost. And then, out of the rubble, something stirred. Not life as it had been before, but something stranger. Something stitched together from fragments of the old world, from scraps of science that should have died, and whispers of magic that refused to fade. In that stillness, she formed. Her body was not flesh, not bone, but sugar and gum, shaped with hands unseen. She was not born with a cry, but with silence. Her eyes opened wide into the dark, already heavy with knowing. The world did not welcome her. There was no mother to hold her, no father to guide her. Only the shattered halls of the broken earth, and the echoes of voices that no longer belonged to anyone. She stood, fragile and young, and the shadows stretched toward her as if they recognized her. They called her Candy. They called her sweet. But in her reflection, she saw something else. Her smile was soft, but her eyes were not. They held a glimmer that did not belong to the candy people she would one day create. Her gaze was sharp, ancient, as though she carried within her the memory of the world that came before. The silence followed her everywhere. It lingered in the air around her, as if the ruins themselves were watching. Sometimes in the dead of night, she swore she could hear it breathing. Not the wind, not the shifting of stone, but something patient, something vast, drawing in breath somewhere just beyond her sight. When she touched the broken earth, it shivered. When she walked through the ruins, her footsteps echoed too long, as though the halls remembered. She wondered if she was meant to exist at all, or if she had been forced into being by something that could not let go of the past. And so she rose, a princess in name, though she was only a child. Her skin was sugar, her hair spun from candy, her crown still waiting in the shadows. She was the first light in a dead world. But the shadows did not leave. They clung to her, resting in her smile, moving in her silence. Born from candy, yes, but shaped by something else, something older, something darker, something that waited in the cracks of the earth, watching, remembering. Her life had only just begun, and already the shadows had chosen her. Her first years passed in silence. There was no play, no laughter, no careless hours of running in fields. Princess Bubblegum's childhood was not hers to live. It belonged to the kingdom that leaned upon her, and to the crown that pressed too early upon her head. The candy people looked at her with reverence. To them, she was a mother, a ruler, a symbol of safety. They clapped and cheered, their sugar faces glowing with joy. But when she looked into their eyes, she felt the hollowness of the bond. They were not her parents. They were not her siblings. They were her creations, made by her own hands and born of her own experiments. She had given them life, yet she could never truly belong to them. When other children were taught by gentle voices, she taught herself in rooms of glass and steel. When others clutched dolls and toys, she held vials of glowing syrup, scribbled notes across yellowed pages, and built machines that hummed long into the night. Her toys were inventions. Her lullabies were the low murmur of engines. Her companions were figures she shaped from sugar and gum, none of whom could ever comfort her. Still, she tried to dream. But her dreams were not kind. They came as visions of faces she had never met, voices calling names she did not know, memories that could not be hers. She woke with wet cheeks, confused by a grief she could not name. Each time she wiped the tears quickly, pulled her crown tighter, and reminded herself that she had no time for weakness. At night, when the candy people danced below, she watched from her tower. Their joy drifted up in songs and laughter, yet it felt like a world she could never touch. Her smile was practiced, but her eyes remained distant. She was their princess, but never their equal. Always above them, always apart. Her footsteps often carried her away from the noise, down into the ruins beneath the kingdom. The stone there was old, older than her candy people, older than her reign. The air smelled of dust and time, and her candlelight trembled against the walls. The deeper she went, the heavier the silence became. It was not an empty silence. It was a silence that listened. And then came the iron door. She found it in the lowest chamber, standing against the rock like a wound in the earth. Her hand reached for it without thought. The metal was cold, colder than any stone, colder than any grave. And from behind it, a breath. Not hers. Not the wind. A deep, steady breath, drawn slowly, patiently. She pulled her hand away at once, heart pounding in her chest. She fled the ruins, climbed back into the light of her kingdom and told herself she had imagined it. But in the quiet of her chambers, she could still feel the iron beneath her palm, and she could still hear the breath, soft and endless, waiting in the dark. Her childhood was over before it began. It was a crown without comfort, a kingdom without family, a girl who had never been allowed to be young. The candy people adored her. But in the silence, she knew the truth. She was alone, and something beneath the earth was breathing with her. The candy kingdom rose quickly, its towers glistening with sugarstone, its streets paved with syruped brick. From the outside, it was paradise, a land of laughter, a haven of sweetness, a safe place in a broken world. But beneath the glow of its candy streets, secrets grew like roots in the soil. Secrets that only Bubblegum carried, hidden deep in the marrow of her kingdom. She had given her people life, but their laughter often rang hollow to her ears. She studied them closely, watching how their eyes did not blink long enough, how their smiles lingered just a moment too perfectly. She wondered if she had made them too well, or not well enough. The candy people adored their princess. They cheered her name. They built songs in her honor. But when she passed them by, their voices sometimes overlapped too neatly, as though guided by a single, unseen hand. And in those rare moments of silence, she swore she could hear the faint crackle of sugar shifting within them, like bones grinding against each other. Her palace became a place of experiments. Behind locked doors, machines churned and hissed. Bubbling vats of strange liquid lit the halls in ghostly colors. She worked long into the night, her hands trembling from exhaustion, her eyes stung by the glow of chemical fire. She told herself she was building a safer world. She told herself the experiments were necessary. But late at night, when the halls fell silent, she heard the whispers of her failures. Some experiments never awoke. They remained still on her tables, their forms half finished, their candy eyes sealed shut. She kept them locked away in the lower chambers, lying row upon row in glass coffins. The candy people above never knew. They sang and danced, believing themselves to be her only children, while beneath their feet, an army of silent figures waited, their sugar bodies gleaming in the dark. And still she could not stop. Each day she returned to her laboratories, driven by a hunger she could not explain, to perfect, to control, to silence the breath she had once heard behind the iron door. Perhaps, she thought, if she could create life perfectly, she could drown out whatever life lingered in the shadows. But shadows crept into her kingdom nonetheless. At night the torches flickered, casting long, jagged shapes across her walls. Sometimes she saw figures moving where no one stood. Sometimes she heard voices calling her name from empty corridors. And when she turned to face them, only the sugar walls stared back. Her citizens never questioned their princess. They trusted her with blind devotion, but she questioned herself endlessly. Each failure whispered to her in silence. Each experiment that would not wake haunted her dreams. And always, behind the polished walls of her kingdom, she felt the presence of something ancient pressing in. The Candy Kingdom was bright on the surface, but beneath, in the quiet chambers, it was a mausoleum, a place of unfinished forms, a graveyard for secrets. And the princess, still young, already carried more ghosts than she could count. The deeper she went into her work, the more the kingdom glittered above her. Bright banners, sweet parades, the laughter of candy citizens spilling into every street. But below those streets, in chambers no one else dared to enter, the air grew heavy with something far colder. Here in her laboratories, Princess Bubblegum's hands never rested. Vials boiled with glowing mixtures, machines groaned with effort, and the air tasted of burnt sugar and ash. She worked through every hour of night, her crown tossed aside, her eyes fixed on the bodies that waited on her tables. They were not like the citizens who lived above. These were her secret children, unfinished, unperfected. Some were small, with faces that never formed beyond empty sockets. Others were tall, their limbs too long, their mouths stitched where no mouths should be. They lay motionless in rows of glass caskets, candied skin glistening beneath the flicker of torchlight. She told herself she was making progress. She told herself she was building the future. But even as she whispered words of reassurance, she began to hear something whisper back. At first, she thought it was the hiss of boiling liquid. Then she thought it was the groan of machinery. But one night, as the fire dimmed low, she leaned close to a table of still experiments, and the truth became clear. The sound was voices, soft, fragile, barely louder than breath. They were whispering her name. Her hands trembled. She stepped back, but the whispers grew louder. Not words she could understand, but murmurs that carried meaning. Accusations, longing, a call from something caught between life and death. She tried to silence them. She locked the chamber doors. She built heavier walls. She buried the unfinished deeper into the earth. But the whispers followed. Through the pipes, through the stones, through the silence of her own chambers at night. Sometimes she woke to find her candles already lit, her machines already running, as though unseen hands had stirred them to life. Other times, she found fingerprints in the dust where no one had walked, trails that led to the glass coffins, and then ended. No exit, no return. The candy people above laughed and clapped and called her perfect. But she no longer trusted perfection. She saw how fragile her creations were, how eager the shadows were to fill the cracks. And as the whispers grew stronger, she began to fear the truth. That her experiments had not failed at all, that they were not silent, that they had only learned to wait. In her sleep, she sometimes dreamed of standing in a hall of endless coffins. She pressed her hand to the glass of each one. Behind the sugar fog, pairs of eyes slowly opened, staring back at her. And in unison, every mouth curved into the same smile. When she woke, the silence around her was too complete, too careful, as though something had shut itself away just before she opened her eyes. And so she continued her work, though her hands shook more each night. She built new machines, new mixtures, new bodies. But the whispers never left her. They followed her crown, her footsteps, her dreams. The princess, who had never known childhood, now walked through her own kingdom like a haunted figure. The candy people cheered her in the light. But in the dark, her experiments whispered, and their voices never stopped. By day, the kingdom sparkled. Citizens danced in the streets, their laughter echoing like bells, their songs weaving through the air with sweetness too bright to question. Everywhere she turned, faces beamed at her. Faces she had molded herself, handsome smiles she had stitched into place with the careful hands. Yet the longer she ruled, the more the smiles began to unsettle her. At first it was nothing more than a flicker, a glance that lingered too long, a cheer that rose too perfectly in unison. A crowd of candy faces frozen for a moment too long after the music stopped. She tried to dismiss it as paranoia, as the burden of her sleepless mind. But the feeling grew, and soon it could not be ignored. She would walk among them, her people pressing close with joy, their eyes shining like crystal sugar. And in those eyes, she saw nothing reflected. No depth, no spark of thought. Only the glassy hollowness of beings made to obey. When she turned her back, their voices fell too suddenly into silence. When she entered her chambers, she sometimes swore she heard the faint shuffle of feet outside her door, though no guards had been stationed there. And when she woke in the dead of night, she sometimes caught a shadow moving just beyond the curtain, round heads, sweet faces, watching her until she shifted. By the time she rose to look, the halls were always empty. Their devotion became a mirror she could not escape. Every cheer was too loud. Every bow was too deep. Every smile stretched too wide. The kingdom adored her, but their adoration felt less like love and more like surveillance. She began to test them in small ways, changing her path at the last moment, asking sudden questions, lingering in the streets after dusk, and each time she caught the same unnatural response. Their voices aligned too quickly. Their laughter returned too suddenly. Their heads turned together as though guided by strings. One night, as she crossed the courtyard, she stopped. The citizens surrounding her froze mid-step, their sugar faces locked in smiles. For a breathless second, no one moved. And then all at once, as though on a silent command, they resumed, as if nothing had broken the rhythm. Her heart raced, but she kept her expression calm. They must not see her fear. From that night on, her throne felt like a cage. The people she had created were everywhere, their eyes fixed on her with devotion that felt too sharp, too exact. They cheered when she wanted silence. They clapped when she craved solitude. Their loyalty had no cracks, no mistakes. And that perfection frightened her more than rebellion ever could. At times she wondered, had she given them too much? Or not enough? Were they her children? Her servants? Her reflections? Or something far stranger? Something that wore sweetness like a mask, while hiding hollow hunger beneath. In dreams, she saw them without their smiles. She saw their faces slack, their eyes emptying, their candy shells cracking open to reveal nothing but shadows inside. And in those dreams, they did not cheer. They did not bow. They only stood in silence, staring at her with endless waiting hunger. When she woke, she often found herself trembling. Her crown slipped to the floor beside her bed. She would rise, place it firmly back upon her head, and walk out to greet them again. Her candy people, her hollow-eyed creations, her kingdom of sweetness, where every smile cut deeper than a knife. The throne room was bright. Its pillars were polished sugar. Its banners shimmered with golden thread. Its floor reflected torchlight like liquid amber. To the candy people, it was the heart of paradise. To her, it was a prison of stone and sweetness. She sat upon the throne each day, crown balanced on her head, smile painted across her lips. Her citizens bowed, their voices ringing in perfect unison, their songs echoing through the high, glittering chamber. And yet, as she listened, Her skin crawled. For every cheer sounded rehearsed, every word too precise. It was not the sound of joy, it was the sound of ritual. The throne itself seemed alive beneath her. Its surface, carved from a hardened candy stone, was cold against her skin. The longer she sat, the heavier it grew, as though something beneath the seat pressed upward, trying to rise into her. Sometimes, in the quiet between cheers, she swore she heard it breathing. At night, when the kingdom slept, she did not. The throne room remained lit, her crown still fixed, her back straight, though exhaustion pulled at her bones. She sat there in silence, listening. Her ears caught things others never could. A tapping in the walls, a whisper in the torch flames, the faint scrape of unseen footsteps circling the room. Whenever she turned her head, the silence returned, but her heart knew what her eyes could not prove. The throne had made her queen. But in the shadows of her sleepless nights, she wondered if the throne itself was the true ruler, and she merely its vessel. She tried to leave once. One night, after the last song had ended, she descended the steps, her crown trembling in her hand. She meant to walk the streets alone, to feel the cool air, to escape the throne's heavy presence. But when she opened the doors, a crowd of candy people waited silently outside. Their eyes glistened in the moonlight, their smiles stretched wide. They had not been called. They had not been told. And yet they were there, as if the throne itself had summoned them. She returned at once, locking herself in the great hall. And when she sat back upon the throne, the weight lifted slightly, as though it had been satisfied. From that night on, she dared not resist it again. The throne became her watchtower. She guarded her kingdom endlessly, though she knew she was not guarding against armies or monsters. She was guarding against something she could never name. The silence that stalked her. The shadows that shifted when no one else was watching. The breath she had heard long ago behind the iron door. Her candy people saw her as eternal. A princess who never slept. A ruler who never faltered. But they could not see the truth. That every sleepless night carved deeper shadows beneath her eyes. That her hands trembled when the torches burned too low. That she clutched the arms of her throne as though letting go would mean surrendering herself to something waiting just beyond the edge of sight. She had given her life to her kingdom, and in return, the throne had taken her childhood, her rest, her peace. She was a queen of sweetness in the light, but in the dark, she was nothing more than a prisoner, trapped on a throne that would never let her go. The Candy Kingdom was young. Its walls shone bright. Its towers glittered under the sun. Its people filled the air with laughter. To wander through its streets was to taste paradise, sweetness spun into stone, a dream risen from the ruins of an older, broken world. But beneath the surface, beneath the sugar and song, shadows stretched quietly, shadows that no one spoke of, shadows only she could feel. Princess Bubblegum walked her streets with measured steps, her crown catching the light, her smile flawless. Her citizens bowed and sang her praises, faces glowing with devotion. But behind their cheers, she felt the faintest edge of something else. Not rebellion, not anger, but silence. The kind of silence that listened. At night, she wandered alone, the sound of her footsteps echoing in candy corridors. The kingdom slept, but her thoughts never did. Her eyes often drifted toward the lower halls, to the doors no citizen had seen, to the stairways that spiraled down into stone that was not candy at all. Stone that belonged to a time before her kingdom. The air down there was colder, heavier. The walls bore scratches, grooves worn deep by hands that no longer existed. And in that stillness, her candlelight shook against carvings she could never fully read, symbols older than language, etched with a precision that unsettled her bones. She told herself she descended there for knowledge, that she sought history, records, truth. But in the pit of her chest, she knew it was something else. She was being pulled, drawn by a gravity she could neither resist nor understand. One night she followed the corridors farther than before. The torches had long burned out. Her only light was the trembling flame of her candle, its wax dripping like blood across her hand. And then she found it. A hall of doors, each sealed with iron, each untouched by her people. She pressed her ear to one. Silence. But not empty silence. A silence that breathed. She pulled back quickly, her heart hammering. The shadows along the walls seemed to stretch closer, their edges jagged, their shapes uncertain. She hurried back up the stairs, back into the glow of her kingdom, back to the safety of smiles and songs. But safety was an illusion. She knew it then. For the Candy Kingdom had been built bright and beautiful, yes, but it had been built on top of something else. Something buried, something that had not forgotten. And though she returned to her throne, though she wore her smile, though she ruled as the perfect princess, the memory of those doors followed her. The silence of the lower halls pressed into her dreams, and the kingdom above, her kingdom of sweetness, suddenly felt like a mask hiding something darker, something waiting just below. Days passed, and she tried to forget the iron doors. She buried herself in routine, councils with her candy people, festivals of song, rituals of joy. But at the edge of every smile, the memory lingered. The chill of stone under her palm, the silence that was not silence, the breath that was not hers. She told herself she would not return, and yet, as nights grew long, her footsteps betrayed her. The palace above slept, but her body carried her downward, as if the shadows themselves guided her. The halls seemed different this time. The torches burned lower, their flames bent as though pulled by some unseen current. The stone walls glistened with moisture that had never been there before. She held her candle higher, but its light struggled, fighting against the weight of the dark. The air grew colder with each step. Not the natural chill of stone, but a cold that pressed against her chest, slowed her breath, tightened her throat. It was the cold of a place that had not seen light in lifetimes, a cold that remembered. At last, she stood again before the doors, iron, towering, silent. But this time, she saw something she had missed before. Across the surface of one door, etched faintly into the metal as were marks, symbols like the ones she had seen carved into the walls above, but deeper, sharper. And when her fingers brushed them, they burned. She recoiled, clutching her hand. Her skin was unmarked, but she swore the heat still lingered under her flesh. And in that instant, silence broke. A whisper, so faint, oh, so fragile. It could have been the wind, but no wind moved in those halls. The whisper came from behind the door. It called no name, spoke no word, yet its meaning curled directly into her bones. It was aware. It was waiting. Her candle guttered. For a moment, she stood in nearly total darkness, the iron looming before her, the whispers stretching into her ears. When the flame steadied again, the door was unchanged, silent and still. But the whisper did not leave her. It followed her back up the halls, up the stairways, into her chambers. It breathed with her. It lay with her in bed. It never stopped. Above, the candy people sang their songs. Their laughter filled the kingdom like sunlight. But inside her, a shadow had settled, planted by the iron doors. She could no longer hear their joy without also hearing the faint, endless breath from the dark below. The candy kingdom glittered, but its foundations groaned, and only she knew what slept beneath. The whispers did not fade. They lingered at the edges of every hour, slipping between the words of her people, weaving themselves into the silence of her sleep. Sometimes faint, sometimes almost clear, a rhythm of breath, a murmur of voices that should not exist. Princess Bubblegum grew restless. She returned to her laboratories, but even among the clatter of machines and the hiss of boiling mixtures, she still heard it. The sound of the doors below, calling without words. At last, she did what her mind had forbidden and her heart demanded. She began to study. She gathered scraps of old parchment, fragments of maps, ancient pages burned at their edges. Relics of the world before. Among them, again and again, she found the same patterns. Spirals carved into stone, lines circling downward like stairs without end. Symbols too sharp, too deliberate, drawn by hands that had known exactly what they meant. By candlelight, she copied them, tracing the strange marks she had seen on the iron doors. Her pen shook, ink bleeding across the paper. And as the shapes took form, she felt something stir in the air around her. The flame bent. The glass of her instruments trembled. It was as though even the act of drawing them gave the symbols life. Night after night she studied. Night after night she returned to the doors. Her fear had not lessened, but her curiosity had sharpened into hunger. She needed to know what lay beyond. The candy people never saw this part of her. They danced in the courtyards, their sugar voices rising in song, their eyes bright with trust. To them, she was perfect, but behind her smile, her mind spun with darkness. When she looked at their faces, sometimes she imagined them crumbling away, their shells collapsing, revealing the whispers that breathed beneath the kingdom. On her fifth descent, she noticed something new. The iron door she had touched, the one that had burned her hand, no longer sat perfectly sealed. It was subtle, a hair's width at most, but she saw it. A line of darkness, thin as a blade, stretching down its edge. Something had shifted. Something had moved. She did not touch it this time. Her candle flickered violently, as though begging her to leave. She turned back, her steps quick, but even as she fled upward, she swore the air behind her grew warmer, like a long breath exhaled into the hall. That night she did not sleep. Her crown lay beside her bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her ears straining against silence. And in that silence, she heard it clearly for the first time. Not just breathing, not just whispering, a word. Her name, soft, drawn out, as as if spoken by lips pressed against the other side of the door. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, but the sound did not fade. It followed her into her dreams. It followed her into waking. And with every breath she took, she felt the doors below taking one with her. The kingdom above sparkled. But she no longer trusted the light, for she knew, with every beat of her heart, that something in the dark was awake. The name followed her now. Not only in the dark halls beneath the kingdom, not only in the chambers where she studied, but in the open light of day. She would be speaking with her people, her voice calm, her face steady. And then, a flicker, a breath at her ear. Her name, dragged slow and quiet, as though the shadows themselves spoke it. She never turned. She knew there would be nothing to see. But her heart raced all the same. For if the whispers had once belonged to the doors, they no longer stayed buried. They had begun to crawl upward. Her experiments, too, began to change. Once her creations were bright things. Candy people, full of laughter, innocent, unafraid. Now her hands shook when she molded them. Now the mixtures boiled darker, the sugar thicker, the forms less certain. She told herself it was chance and nothing mistakes in the process. But when she looked at them closely, she saw the truth. The shapes of her people bore echoes of the symbols from below. Their eyes lingered too long. Their smiles stretched a shade too wide. And sometimes, when they thought she wasn't watching, their lips moved, as if repeating whispers she could not hear. She began to test them. Late at night, when the kingdom slept, she summoned one into her laboratory. A child made of caramel, innocent in form, eyes soft with trust. She asked simple questions. It answered gently. But as the candle burned lower, she asked about the doors. And for the briefest moment, its face changed. Its eyes darkened. Its voice dropped. Open? She staggered back, nearly toppling the table. The child blinked, confused, its face returning to sweetness. It did not remember what it had said, but she remembered. From then on, she noticed it everywhere. In the way her subjects gathered at the edges of the palace at night, their faces turned toward the earth as if listening. In the way their songs, once bright and unbroken, sometimes faltered on one strange low note, a note that did not belong. Even in the laughter of the streets, she swore she heard her name woven into the sound, like a thread of darkness hidden in a tapestry of light. Her kingdom was still alive, still joyous, still loyal, but it was changing. And the more it changed, the more she realized that she was not its only creator. Something else had its hand upon them. Something beneath. The next time she descended to the lower halls, she brought no candle. She wanted the truth, and truth did not need light. The darkness pressed around her, heavy, complete. Her footsteps echoed against stone carved long before her reign. And when she reached the doors, she no longer pressed her ear against them. She simply stood, breathing. And the doors breathed back. Not one voice, many. Layered, writhing, whispering her name in a chorus that clawed into her chest. The iron seemed to pulse. The stone seemed to shudder. And for the first time, she realized something she had not dared admit. The doors were not keeping her out. They were keeping something in. The kingdom above glittered as always. Banners waved. Candy people sang. Children played in the streets, their laughter carried by the wind. But to her, the brightness had soured. It was a mask, thin and brittle. For every sound of joy, she heard the faint echo of whispers beneath. The doors were weakening. She knew it. She had felt it. What once had been sealed tight now breathed. The iron was no longer still. It pulsed faintly, as though something behind it pressed gently, waiting for the right moment to push harder. Her studies confirmed the fear. In her lab, surrounded by books and broken fragments of the old world, she pieced together the patterns. The Candy Kingdom was not an accident of her design. Its foundations had been chosen. Its walls built deliberately above the buried halls. The stone, the doors, the whispers, all had existed before her rule. And when she rose as princess, the weight of it had passed her. Not by chance, by inheritance. She remembered the symbols on the iron, how they burned when she touched them. And in her endless research, a dreadful truth revealed itself. Those symbols were not locks. They were seals, living seals. And they had been carved with purpose, not to hold forever, but to wait. Her heart sank as the realization sharpened. The seals responded to her, not her people, not the kingdom, her. One night she tested it. Alone, deep below, she pressed her hand once more against the iron. The whisper came instantly, rising sharp in her ear. Her name, spoken with hunger. And then, the metal shifted. Only slightly, only a breath. But enough. The seals did not resist her. They recognized her. They yielded. She stumbled back, her chest tight with panic. The truth was inescapable now. Whatever was imprisoned below, he did not need to break the doors. It only needed her. In the days that followed, her subjects noticed the change. Her smiles were rarer, her words shorter. She seemed distracted, her gaze drifting toward the ground, as if she listened to something no one else could hear. And when she worked in her lab, her creations began to grow stranger. Some came out twisted, their sugar forms brittle, their eyes wide with terror. Others emerged too still, too quiet, as though waiting for a command that never came. At night, she tried to resist. She locked her chamber doors, surrounded herself with candlelight, filled the air with music to drown the whispers. But the darkness seeped in anyway. Her name stretched across her walls, her ceilings, her dreams. She awoke some mornings with the taste of stone in her mouth, her hands coated in dust she could not explain. She had not only been hearing the doors, she had been answering them. The Candy Kingdom believed her immortal, eternal, untouchable. But alone in the silence of her throne, she finally understood. She was not their protector. She was their weakness, their princess, their ruler, and perhaps their undoing. The doors groaned in the darkness, not with wind, not with stone settling, but with intent. A slow, deliberate pressure that pulsed through the air and into her bones. She stood before them, candle in hand, the flickering light trembling with every beat of her heart. The whispers had grown insistent, layered now in a chorus of voices she could not distinguish. Her name, her fears, her thoughts, all called from the other side. The iron door shifted again, a fraction more than before, and she knew she could not stop it. Below, the shadows stretched and twisted, shapes that had once been silent, waiting patiently for centuries, now pressed against the seals. Not out of malice alone, but recognition. She was the key. Her mind raced. If she opened the door, what would emerge? Would it destroy the kingdom above? Would it devour her? Or would it finally answer the questions she had carried since birth? Who made her? Why was she born? What lay beneath the sweetness she had built? Her candlelight flickered violently. The walls hummed faintly, and she felt it. The pull. The unseen presence pressing through the metal, through stone, through the sugar glass layers of her kingdom. She pressed her hand to the door. The whispers became a roar. They filled her ears. They filled her mind. They promised knowledge. They promised power. They promised release. She staggered back, her breath ragged. The choice stretched before her. To face what was beneath and risk everything, or to retreat, leaving the shadows coiled and patient, waiting for another moment, another weakness. Her fingers trembled on the crown at her head. Her life had been a kingdom of sweetness built over darkness. Her childhood had been stolen. Her creations had begun to whisper. And now the very foundations of all she ruled demanded attention. She knelt before the doors. The candlelight shivered. The walls seemed to bend closer. And for the first time, she understood that the kingdom above, with all its brightness and smiles, was only as safe as she allowed it to be. The iron groaned again, a fraction more, and the shadows pressed closer. Her heart pounded. She inhaled slowly. She exhaled. And then, the choice. She could open the door, or she could remain its prisoner. But she knew, no matter what she chose, the kingdom, the creations, the candy people, and even herself would never be the same. The whispers rose to a crescendo, filling the halls, pouring into her mind. The iron quivered beneath her hand, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Princess Bubblegum, ruler of sweetness, child of shadows, master of life and death, stood on the edge of everything. And the secret beneath her kingdom waited. Even in the brightest halls of the Candy Kingdom, a shadow lingered. Not outside, not in the corners of the streets, but in the laboratories, where Princess Bubblegum spent her nights among bubbling vials, humming machines, and half-formed creations. Her hands were steady, precise, but her heart was never still. Each experiment was a whisper of life, a fragment of possibility, and yet each carried a hint of something more, something darker. Some experiments had never awakened. Sugar bodies, delicate as porcelain, awaited her touch. Eyes closed, faces serene, but when she lingered too long, she swore she could hear them breathe, soft, shallow breaths. Not quite alive, not quite still. She would shake her head and press onward. Perfection was her goal. Every candy creation had to be flawless, obedient, and safe. But the silence of the ones that did not wake followed her into dreams. And in her waking hours, she began to hear it there too, a faint whisper, slipping between the hiss of machines, the bubbling of liquids, the scratching of her pen against parchment. The voices were soft at first, indistinct, a breath here, a sigh there. But they grew, layered, deliberate. They seemed to echo her own thoughts, mocking her, reminding her of the line she had crossed, the life she had tried to control. She began to notice patterns. Certain mixtures hummed louder when she entered. Glass caskets would tremble. Candies she thought inert would shift imperceptibly. It was as if the experiments themselves remembered her presence, responded to it, and waited. One night she leaned over a half-formed figure, its sugar skin still wet with syrup, its face only faintly shaped. She whispered a question, soft, experimental, almost afraid. "Are you awake?" For a heartbeat, nothing. And then, a whisper in reply. Her candle flickered violently. The laboratory seemed to shrink around her. Machines groaned as if alive. The half-formed figure's sugar lips moved, just barely, shaping a word she could not recognize. She recoiled. Her heart thundered. And yet, she could not look away. For in that whisper, in that impossible movement, she glimpsed the truth. Her experiments were not silent. They never had been. From that night on, the whispering never ceased. It followed her through corridors and lingered in stairwells, and even slipped into the palace above. She ruled with her crown in place, her smile fixed. But behind the sweetness, her mind spun with unease. The candy people never noticed. Their lives continued in perfect rhythm, unaware of the voices that threaded through her kingdom. But she heard them. Always. And she began to wonder, did she control her experiments, or did they control her? The laboratory no longer felt like a room. It was a living thing. The candles flickered, not from wind, but from the soft exhalation of the sugar figures she had built. Machines groaned softly, their cogs and pistons trembling with some invisible heartbeat, and the whispers, they had grown louder. Not just faint breathings, but voices now, layered and insistent, calling her name, questioning her touch, guiding her hands even as she tried to resist. The half-formed figures stirred more often. Some would twitch as she approached, their candy limbs bending in ways they should not. Others shifted when she turned away, sliding across tables and shelves in near silence, their glassy eyes tracking her even when they were meant to be closed. She tried to dismiss it as her imagination. She tried to convince herself that she alone had heard the whispers. But one night she caught it clearly. A full-formed candy person, perfect and complete, leaned forward and whispered in a voice too small, too sweet, words that were not hers. "Do you hear them too?" The figure froze, then its eyes flickered, and for a moment, she saw a shadow behind the sugar mask, a depth, a hunger, something older than her kingdom. She stepped back, her candle shaking in her grip. The laboratory felt impossibly large now, walls bending slightly, shadowed corners deepening as though swallowing the light. And she understood. Her experiments were not just creations. They were listeners, students, witnesses, and now they were beginning to speak. Over the following nights, she became obsessed. Every unfinished figure, every still vial, every machine that hummed to life on its own was studied, cataloged, measured. She scribbled notes, tried to map the patterns of movement, the rhythms of the whispers. But the deeper she looked, the less she understood. Her hands shook as if her own life had been infused into the creations that now moved, breathed, and murmured behind her. Some experiments awoke completely. Candies with delicate faces, molded hands, and synthetic smiles would rise from their tables, stand in the shadows, and watch her for hours without blinking. They never spoke aloud, not yet, but their presence pressed against her mind, whispering in a language she could not yet decipher. The more she tried to control them, the more insistent they became. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night to find her laboratory doors open, figures moving along the walls, their candy feet silent on stone floors, their eyes following her as she slept. And the whispers, her name repeated in rising layers, were no longer just in the lab. They followed her into the palace, into her chambers, into the streets where her people laughed and danced. She realized then the most terrifying truth. The experiments did not belong to her. She was no longer the creator. She was merely the caretaker of something older, something that had been waiting for the right mind, the right hands, to awaken it. And the shadows beneath the Candy Kingdom had begun to move in rhythm with her heartbeat. The laboratory had become a place she no longer fully controlled. Candies stirred before she touched them. Vials shook as if breathing. Machines groaned and hissed in response to her presence, their mechanisms moving without her command. And the whispers. They had grown insistent, pressing against the walls, curling around her mind, slipping into every thought she had. Some experiments began to awaken. At first, only slightly, a finger twitching, a head turning, a glassy eye blinking. Then more boldly. Candies she had left lifeless on tables now rose silently, their forms glistening in the dim candlelight, their sugar skin reflecting her face back at her, like mirrors with subtle distortions. One evening she leaned over a vat of molten syrup as you adjusting the temperature with shaking hands. She heard it then, the whisper clear and deliberate. "Help us." She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The sugar figures around her remained still, or so she thought. The soft scrape of sugar against stone told her otherwise. They were moving when she wasn't looking. Small steps, slow rotations of heads. Their hollow eyes watched, not with curiosity, but with intention. Fear settled into her chest, heavy and immovable. Her experiments had always been silent. They had always obeyed her. But now, they seemed to act on their own will. She tried to ignore it. She told herself she was imagining it. She focused on her notes, on the meticulous recording of formulas and outcomes. But each time she looked away, something had shifted. A figure once lying down now sat upright. A vial of chemical, once still, now bubbled on its own. And the whispers, softer than before, told her secrets she had not asked to know. Of the failures she had discarded, of the life she had stolen, of the darkness she had nurtured in silence. One night, she could not bear it any longer. She closed the laboratory doors, bolted them from the inside, and pressed her forehead to the cold wood. The whispers pressed back. The sugar figures tapped and shuffled. The machines hummed faster, and a single, insistent phrase rang in her ears. "You made us. We remember. We wait." Tears blurred her vision. She realized the truth she had always feared. Her experiments were alive, and they were not her servants anymore. They were her witnesses, her judges. And the longer she ignored them, the louder their whispers became. In that moment, she understood. She could no longer pretend to be their master. The laboratory, the experiments, the whispers, they were something else now. Something older. Something that remembered every failure, every creation abandoned, every shadow she had left untouched. And the Candy Kingdom above, bright and cheerful as it seemed, was now merely the surface of a world, already listening, already watching, already whispering. The whispers were no longer distant. They had grown bold. They spoke in tones she could almost understand, soft syllables curling through the air like smoke, pressing against her consciousness, influencing her thoughts, her movements, her hands. The experiments began to change in response. Figures that had once been motionless now moved deliberately. Their limbs bent unnaturally, heads tilting with uncanny awareness. Eyes, once glassy and empty, now tracked her every step, flickering with reflections of the laboratory's candlelight. Some whispered back, their voices blending with the chorus of the unseen, a sound like sugar scraping over stone. One evening, she approached a half-finished candy figure. Its form was delicate, fragile, almost like a child made of sugar and syrup. As she adjusted its limbs, it twitched sharply and looked up at her. Its lips formed a single word. Why? The candlelight trembled, throwing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe across the walls. The question echoed in her mind, as if the laboratory itself had asked her. Why had she created them? Why had she pushed life into the forms that now whispered in her ears? Why had she abandoned so many? She stumbled backward, her hand shaking. And then she noticed it. The floor beneath her experiments had begun to hum. A low, persistent vibration, growing louder with every moment. The glass coffins, the vats, the unfinished figures, all resonated, all listened. And when she tried to speak, the whispers surged into her voice, forming words she had not intended, pleading, warning, accusing. The candy kingdom above seemed farther away than ever. She walked its streets, her crown perched stiffly on her head, the citizens' laughter ringing hollow in her ears. The whispers followed her, threading through the songs and claps, breathing life into every empty smile. She realized with a shiver that the kingdom had never been hers alone. It had been listening, absorbing her presence, absorbing her mind. That night she returned to the laboratory, heart hammering. The figures were no longer inert. They had gathered along the edges of the room, heads turned, eyes wide. A chorus of whispers filled the chamber. Her name, her thoughts, her regrets, folded into a language she could not fully understand. And then in the center of the room, the half-finished figures moved as one. They reached toward her, arms trembling like the strings of a puppet she could not see. The whispers rose to a crescendo, penetrating her mind, threading her thoughts with their intent. Wake. Listen. Become. Princess Bubblegum backed away, the crown sliding from her head. She understood now. These were no longer experiments. They were entities. They were alive. And they were not asking for her control. They were asking for her submission. The candy kingdom above, bright and sweet, was nothing compared to the chorus below. The whispers filled the corridors, the laboratories, her mind. And Princess Bubblegum knew, with a weight heavier than sugar or stone, that her creations had become her reality, and she could no longer escape it. The laboratory was no longer a safe place. Candies moved of their own accord. Machines hummed as if breathing. Vials bubbled without cause. And the whispers, they had grown insistent, omnipresent, a pulse threading through every corner of her life. At first she noticed subtle changes above in the kingdom she ruled. Candy people would freeze mid-step, heads turning unnaturally as if listening to some secret rhythm. Children paused in play, eyes glassy, smiles faltering. Even the streets seemed quieter, the air thick with the unseen, filled with murmurs that echoed beneath the sugar glass buildings. The experiments below were teaching them. Or perhaps the whispers had always been there, waiting for a mind like hers to awaken them. She could feel the pull, a force threading through the walls, through the streets, through the lives of every Candy citizen. One night, she descended alone. The doors of the laboratory creaked closed behind her. The candlelight flickered violently. She watched as her half-formed figures moved in deliberate patterns. They were no longer trembling at her presence. They were performing, dancing, circling, their eyes following her with unsettling awareness. And then she heard her name, not whispered, not in the soft hush of breath. It came from every direction at once, layered and sharp, pressing into her skull like ice. She tried to flee, but the floor seemed to pulse beneath her steps, pulling her toward the center of the room. A figure rose before her, an experiment she had thought incomplete. Its candy skin cracked, its eyes hollow, yet it moved with purpose. Its lips, faintly trembling, shaped words. "Your kingdom is ours now." Her heart hammered. Her hands shook. The crown slipped from her head and rolled across the floor. The other experiments began to close in, their whispers merging into a single, insistent chorus. They no longer asked. They demanded. Above, the kingdom carried on unaware. Candy people laughed, danced, and sang. But the streets and buildings pulsed faintly, as if the entire kingdom itself were listening, waiting for her next move. She realized the truth. Her creations had not only awakened, they had learned. They had begun to influence life outside the laboratory. Her kingdom's light, its joy, its very sweetness, was now threaded with shadows of her own making. She sank to her knees. The whispers rose, a tide around her mind. Her failures, her doubts, her ambitions, all reflected back at her with voices that were not her own. She could fight, but she could feel it. The line between ruler and creation was dissolving. Her experiments were no longer hers. They were a force that reached into every corner of her world. And Princess Bubblegum knew, with a terror that froze her blood, that soon she would have to choose. To submit to what she had created, or risk losing everything herself, the kingdom, and the life she thought she had built. The laboratory had become a chamber of living shadows. Candies moved like a tide, their sugar limbs bending with unnatural grace. Machines groaned, vials bubbled with no heat, and the whispers were everywhere, wrapping around her mane, threading through her thoughts, melding with her heartbeat until she could no longer tell where she ended and they began. She stumbled into the center of the room, her crown fallen, her hand shaking. The experiments swirled around her, a chorus of sugar and shadow, their hollow eyes alive with intent. And the whispers spoke as one, a voice older than the kingdom itself. Wake, serve, become. Her own thoughts rose in panic, but they were no longer fully her own. Every doubt she had buried, every secret she had hidden, echoed in the chorus, pressing her to obey, to answer, to give herself fully to the force she had created. One of the half-formed figures reached out, its sugar fingers trembling, then solidifying with purpose. It touched her arm. The contact burned like ice. A surge of images flashed in her mind. The abandoned experiments, the failures she had hidden, the shadows beneath the Candy Kingdom, all whispering, all waiting. The boundaries between laboratory and kingdom blurred. Above, Candy people froze mid-step, their songs faltering. Buildings seemed to lean, streets shimmered, as if the kingdom itself listened to the dark will rising below. The experiments were no longer confined. They had reached outward, They were rewriting the world. Tears blurred her vision. Her crown lay across the cold floor, a symbol of authority that now felt meaningless. She realized the horror she had long ignored. She had not merely created life. She had awakened a consciousness older, sharper, and far more cunning than her own. And it recognized her. It demanded her submission. She fell to her knees. The whispers surged, folding her memories, her fears, her ambitions into the rhythm. She tried to resist. She tried to reclaim control. But every gesture, every thought, every breath was intercepted. Her experiments circled her, their voices forming a lattice of intention that trapped her mind. And then, in the crescendo of the chorus, she understood. The Candy Kingdom. Her creations, even her own identity, were now intertwined with the whispers. There was no escape. Only choice, to surrender or to be undone. Princess Bubblegum, the eternal ruler of sweetness, stood at the edge of everything she had. The streets of the Candy Kingdom gleamed with sugary light. Laughter floated from corners, songs danced along the breeze, and the citizens moved in perfect rhythm, their candy faces bright, their smiles wide. Yet beneath the sweetness, something had shifted. Something quiet, patient, and watching. Princess Bubblegum walked among them, her crown catching the sunlight, her robes brushing the candy-stone streets. She smiled at their greetings, her eyes scanning every face. But she noticed things others did not. A subtle pause here, a blink too long there, a gaze that lingered just a heartbeat too long. The candy people were no longer simply citizens. They were observers, listeners, eyes wide, mouths smiling, but their smiles were hollow, their gazes fixed and knowing. It was as if they remembered everything she did, everything she hid, and yet pretended not to see. At first, she tried to dismiss it. They were her creations, made from sugar and syrup, brought to life by her hand. It was natural for them to watch her. But then she noticed the rhythm, the pauses in their movements, the slight synchronization of their eyes, the way their heads subtly tilted, all pointing towards something beyond ordinary perception. At night, the streets were quieter. The laughter faded into a brittle silence. She would walk among the candy houses, her crown heavy on her head, her heart heavier in her chest. The hollow eyes followed her still, catching her in every reflection, shimmering in windows and polished candy floors. Sometimes she swore they whispered. Soft, fleeting murmurs, threads of sound she could not understand. She spun, but the streets were empty. Only their eyes remained, fixed, unblinking, aware. And she realized then the truth she had tried to ignore. Her citizens were no longer simple creations. They were witnesses, guardians, or perhaps something far more dangerous. Each day their movements grew sharper, more deliberate. Their smiles remained perfect, but the hollowness deepened. And with every passing moment, Princess Bubblegum felt a subtle weight on her shoulders. The knowledge that she was no longer the ruler of a simple kingdom of candy. She was the caretaker of something alive, something aware, something watching her from eyes that should have belonged to innocence, but now reflected only shadows. By morning, the streets seemed unchanged. Candy towers gleamed in sunlight. Children's laughter echoed as if nothing were amiss. But Princess Bubblegum knew better. She could feel it in the subtle shifts of her citizens, in the rhythm of their movements, in the too long pauses of their heads, in the way their hollow eyes followed her, tracking her, always tracking her. At first, the changes were almost imperceptible. A hand lingering on a railing a second too long. A tilt of a head that didn't belong to natural curiosity. But soon it escalated. Small groups of citizens moved as one, their motions unnervingly synchronized. Even when she stepped into an empty square, she could feel them there, a presence she could not ignore. They no longer needed instructions. Tasks she had assigned were completed before she gave them. Buildings repaired before she ordered it. Celebrations prepared before she planned. And when she tried to speak to them, their responses were almost automatic, too perfect, too precise, as though rehearsed by something beyond her control. One evening, she wandered the palace gardens alone. The sun had set, leaving the streets bathed in the soft glow of candy lamps. She thought she was alone. But from the shadows, a group of citizens emerged. They moved silently, their smiles wide, their hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light. No words passed between them, but she felt the pressure of their attention, like 1,000 tiny hands pressing against her mind. A whisper, or perhaps her imagination, slipped into her ears. "Do you see what we see?" She spun, but there was no one. Only their hollow gazes following her from the edges of the garden. She stumbled back toward the palace, her heart pounding. And that was when she realized her citizens had changed. Not just physically, not just in their expressions, but in the way they thought, in the way they observed, in the way they remembered. By nightfall, she could not sleep. Every corner of the palace felt alive with them, their hollow eyes catching her in mirrors, their whispers threading through the halls. Even the laughter of the candy people above, bright and cheerful, now seemed layered with something else, an awareness, a patience, a shadowed intelligence that she could neither name nor banish. And as she lay in her bed, crown beside her, she understood the truth. The candy kingdom she had ruled for so long was no longer hers alone. Her citizens were awake, their hollow eyes filled with knowledge and intent, and they were waiting. The candy kingdom had never been silent. Even at night, the streets hummed with the echoes of laughter, footsteps, and song. But now the hum carried something else, a rhythm she could feel in her bones, a presence she could sense behind every doorway, every candy window, every polished cobblestone. Her citizens had learned to move in ways that unnerved her. They appeared in places she hadn't seen them enter. They lingered in corridors too narrow to cross unnoticed. And their hollow eyes. They were no longer passive. They watched her, studied her, predicted her movements. And sometimes, just sometimes, she swore that they whispered in voices she could almost understand. "Do you see? We see. We know." She tried to assert control, to remind herself that she was their creator, that they owed obedience to her will. But every command she gave was met with compliance that felt rehearsed, like actors following a script she had never written. And the more she tried to dominate them, the more deliberate their movements became. One evening, she walked through the city square. The citizens smiled as she passed. At first, she felt relief. But then she noticed the pattern. Heads tilted in unison, hands moving in synchronized gestures, their hollow eyes reflecting not her image, but the shadows of something she could not name. A chill ran through her. She had never built obedience like this. She had never intended consciousness beyond her own control. And yet, here they were, thinking in ways she could not predict, acting in ways she had never taught. By nightfall, she was trapped in the palace. Doors closed behind her, hallways stretched longer than usual, and every reflection showed her citizens standing just beyond her sightline. A soft chorus of whispers filled the halls. Her name, her regrets, her fears, woven into patterns she could not decipher. She tried to speak to assert her authority, but the words twisted in her mouth, absorbed by the weight of awareness surrounding her. The realization hit her like ice. The candy people she had created were no longer mere citizens. They were observers, teachers, witnesses, and perhaps something more, something patient, something capable of remembering every secret she had buried, every experiment she had hidden, every shadow she had left untouched. And as she looked out over the glittering streets, smiling and singing under the candy moon, she knew one thing with unbearable clarity. Her kingdom was awake. Her citizens were awake. And the hollow eyes that watched her were waiting for her next move. The palace that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a cage. Every corridor stretched longer. Every window seemed to watch her. And every reflection in the polished candy walls betrayed the hollow eyes of her citizens. They were everywhere, silent, waiting. It began subtly at first. Orders she gave to repair buildings or prepare festivities were carried out before her instructions were complete. She watched, heart tightening, as groups of candy citizens moved in precise formations, their actions synchronized in a way no ordinary community could achieve. Then came the moments that could not be ignored. During a council meeting, she asked a simple question about preparations for the next festival. Before she could finish, every citizen present had responded with identical phrasing. The words were hers, but not her tone. Something beneath the surface had shaped them. By night, the streets themselves seemed alive. Walking alone, she heard soft footsteps following her. Turning corners, she found the citizens standing in impossible patterns, heads tilted, eyes hollow, as if the entire kingdom had reorganized itself around her. And then, a whisper unmistakable and cold. "Do you remember who you are?" Her chest tightened. It was not just a question. It was a challenge. A reminder that the power she had assumed over them was no longer absolute. They remembered. They judged. And they waited for her to falter. She tried to retreat to the safety of her laboratory. But the shadows moved there too. Vials trembled without reason. Machines hummed with a life she could not command. And the whispers, now countless, swirled around her mind. Why did you leave us? Why did you hide? What did you fear? Even her most loyal creations, the ones she had trusted for years, acted differently now. They did not disobey, but they did not follow either. They watched. And the more she tried to assert control, the more deliberate their silence became. The Candy Kingdom, so bright and cheerful to outsiders, was alive in ways she could no longer understand. Her citizens were no longer merely her people. They were witnesses. They were sentinels. And the hollow eyes that had once been gentle now glimmered with awareness and with expectation. By midnight, she realized the terrifying truth. Her citizens had learned to see everything she did, to anticipate every move, to respond before she commanded, and most frightening of all, to judge her. The hollow eyes that had once reflected her light now reflected shadows, and those shadows were waiting for her next mistake. The Candy Kingdom had become a mirror of unease. Every corner, every polished street, every candy-tiled building seemed alive. Her citizens moved with purpose she could not predict. Their hollow eyes followed her relentlessly, tracking her thoughts as much as her movements. Orders she gave no longer carried authority. Buildings were repaired before her instructions finished. Celebrations were planned before she spoke. Even simple tasks, like gathering ingredients for her experiments, were completed without her intervention. It was as if the kingdom itself had learned to anticipate her will, and sometimes to override it. One evening she walked alone through the city square. The sun had dipped below the candy horizon, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers. She noticed citizens standing in impossible formations, heads tilted at identical angles, their hollow eyes glimmering with awareness. They did not move when she approached. They did not speak. But she felt them pressing on her mind, a subtle weight that made every step heavier. Then came the whisper, "Do you fear us?" It was not spoken aloud. It came from the shadows, from the streets, from the very air around her. Her heartbeat accelerated. Every instinct screamed that she was no longer the ruler of this kingdom. She was an observer in her own creation. By nightfall, she retreated to the palace. The corridors stretched longer than memory allowed. Reflections in polished candy walls showed citizens where none stood. Soft footsteps echoed behind her even when halls were empty. And the hollow eyes followed, never blinking, never leaving. Her most loyal creations, those she had trusted for years, no longer moved at her command. They stood still, watching, waiting. Even her experiments, once obedient, shifted slightly, their sugar forms trembling, their eyes faintly glowing as if alive with the whispers. Princess Bubblegum understood the horrifying truth. Her citizens had not just grown aware. They had grown deliberate. They were no longer content to simply exist under her rule. They judged her. They planned. And they waited for the moment she faltered. The hollow eyes reflected her own reflection back at her, but distorted. Not sweetness, not light, but shadows. Shadows that knew her fears, her regrets, and the secrets she had buried in the corners of the kingdom. By the time the moon hung high in the candy sky, she realized she could not ignore it any longer. Her citizens were no longer her people. They were something else entirely, sentinels, watchers, and possibly the harbingers of a fate she had not yet imagined. The Candy Kingdom was no longer a kingdom. It was a web. Every street, every tower, every smile was connected. And at the center of it, Princess Bubblegum stood alone, crown fallen, robes brushing the candy stone floor, her heart pounding against the weight of awareness that surrounded her. The citizens moved in perfect synchronization, their hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light of evening. They surrounded her, yet not aggressively. There was no need. The pressure of their observation was enough. Every thought she tried to hide, and every doubt she tried to suppress, was reflected back at her in their unblinking gazes. Soft whispers filled the air, a chorus that she could not block, a tide of voices threading through her mind. Why do you rule? Why do you hide? Why do you fear us? She tried to speak. Words died on her lips. She tried to move. The streets seemed to bend. The palace halls stretched, and every step was anticipated. Her kingdom, once her domain, had become something alive, something that listened, something that remembered. The citizens pressed closer, yet they did not touch her. They did not need to. Their hollow eyes held intent, and she felt it pressing on her like ice. She realized with horror that she had never truly ruled them. She had only observed them, fed them, shaped them, while a greater awareness, a patient consciousness, had grown within them all along. A single voice, or perhaps the amalgamation of many, rose above the whispers. Do you see now? We have always been awake. The walls seemed to pulse, the streets shimmered, and the Candy Kingdom itself trembled under the weight of their awareness. Her crown lay on the ground, powerless. Her hands shook. Her own reflection in a candy window showed not a ruler, but a subject of observation, trapped in the hollow eyes of her people. Princess Bubblegum took a trembling step forward, and then another. The citizens mirrored her movement, their synchronization exact, their hollow eyes unyielding. And in that moment she understood. Control had never been hers. It had been an illusion, a fragile sweetness masking something patient, something awake, something waiting for her to see the truth. The citizens whispered once more. We see, we remember, we wait. The Candy Kingdom shimmered in the moonlight, bright and cheerful to outsiders, but beneath the surface, the hollow eyes pulsed with awareness, and Princess Bubblegum knew she could never unsee what they had become. She was no longer the ruler. She was part of their world, and the hollow eyes would watch, always, until the end of everything she had built.